Welcome to the M1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host as always, Marcus Sadu, and today we're talking with four-time USA memory champion Nelson Dellis. So Nelson is on the show to share a bunch of his memory tips with us. So we're going to go into how much of your memory is determined by genetics or who your parents are, Nelson's 3-step memory process, how to use things like sex and humor as a memory tool. Also smell and memory. I was really interested in Nelson's answer for that specifically. How to remember names, how to remember where you put your keys, and then we're going to wrap up with some diet and brain health stuff because Nelson had a few questions for me. So just as a little aside, this episode does contain a few expletives. I swear here and there in a bunch of the podcast episodes, but Nelson takes us through an example of specific cards in a deck and how he remembers them. And as he's explaining that, an example or two come up that may be offensive to some folks. I thought it was really interesting personally, but I just wanted to warn you guys of that. So if you're one of those folks, feel free to turn off the podcast, I guess. But I hope you guys enjoy this interview with Nelson Dellis. One of the first questions that tends to pop up for folks around memory is like, okay, how much of our memories are determined by genetics or essentially who our parents are? And then to what extent can we build or improve them?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. So, I mean, in terms of, I don't know the whole science behind everything, but if I were to look at my parents, for example, and their memories, they're pretty good. My dad's a smart guy. He's a businessman. He can hold numbers in his head because that's what he does. My mom, I don't know if I'd say she has a stellar memory. She definitely doesn't have a poor memory, but she has a good memory, I guess. So no indication there that I'd come out with an amazing memory. So I don't know if there's really any connection there. I could be wrong. But what is clear, and I've discovered this, and through all the people I've kind of worked with over the years, is that we all have a capacity to definitely improve our memories past what we are capable of. And even people who have amazing memories, just kind of naturally, they're good with names or numbers. The stuff that I teach, the stuff that people can learn, still can improve upon that. And then the question is, well, to how far, how much can you improve it? And that's still unknown. And every time there's a record broken at these memory championships, and you think, okay, that's possibly close to the limit of what we could do there. You look at it a few years later and it's advanced even more. So that's always exciting to see and kind of makes you think, what is the limit? And I don't know if I know the answer to that.
Yeah, that's interesting because athletics do seem to be getting better and better. And of course, better drugs play a part in that. But
yeah.
Also, people just seem to be better at, basketball, football, whatever it is, at a younger and younger age. So you're saying that the same applies to memory as far as people getting better and better, faster and faster.
Yeah, and I think memory sports, the stuff we do in memory competitions isn't a complete reflection of all use cases of memory, but it's a pretty good one. And I think memory sports is just like any other sport over history. The beginning, there's a lot of improvement. And then, as more competition comes in, as the envelope keeps getting pushed more, changes are more incremental. But then what you're saying is that, and this is true in memory sports as well, is that the younger competitors that come in get better faster almost. And I think that's just a case of, they know what's possible, the levels that they can achieve when they start. So they go for that. Whereas when I started, it was like here. So I went for that. It's like what you kind of know is the limit, kind of like the 4-minute mile stuff, right? If we knew that was still the limit, people would still be floating around the 4-minute mile. But because people have broken that, it's like, okay, if I'm going to start training to be maybe I can't do that, but, I could train towards beating that, knowing it's possible, So yeah, nowadays in memory sports, we have kids that, I used to have records. I used to be the top and really in the mix around the world. And now, I don't know if I'd hold my own in a world championship, because there's these kids that just blow me away.
That's so interesting. So it's almost like that ceiling keeps on getting higher and higher, and younger kids are able to see what's possible at a younger age, I guess.
Yeah, and people have, me and other people who have kind of built the path, have come up with strategies that are more efficient, and there's more resources out there, so you don't have to experiment or work on the bullshit that led to a dead end, for me or for other memory championships. That's all been figured out, so it's like direct line to being really good, really fast,
That's a great point, man. Now, I'd love to dig into some of those strategies that you're using to achieve some of these amazing memory feats. So what are the core meat and potatoes concepts around memory, and then how do you go about approaching that stuff?
Yeah. So it's kind of the same approach, I think, I like to break it down that way anyways, to keep it simple. It starts with, first of all, trying to turn what you're trying to memorize into some kind of visual picture in your mind. It's been proven through studies that our brains remember pictures a lot better than abstract information. So the goal is kind of to take all the abstract stuff and basically repaint it into something that's visual for us. So you have a number, make it a picture. You have an address, try to make it into a picture. And a picture, that's kind of a broad term, but what it means is basically some imagery in your mind that uses all the senses. It's not just like a photograph necessarily. It's, sure, what does it look like, the shape, the color, but how does it make you feel? What are the textures of it if you were to touch it? What does it smell like? All those details is what I mean by create a picture, right? And try to give it some association basically to things that you already have, as your knowledge base in your mind. So you're taking these foreign objects, let's say a number, 30 digits, and you're trying to weave a pattern into those numbers that relate to something you can imagine, right? Rather than a 3, a 1, a 4, those are symbols, and symbols don't have meanings that come with them. You have to give them meaning. So that's the first step, is kind of turn things into a picture, give them meaning. The second step is, what do you do with these pictures? Thinking in pictures will get you pretty far. Your memory will be improved just by doing that alone. But part of the memory process is being able to correctly and efficiently and accurately pull the information that you've placed in your mind, recall it, right? How often do you have that feeling where you're thinking of something that you just can't quite get it? It's on the tip of your tongue, right? And when the tip of the tongue feeling is, you have it in your head, because if I were to tell you what it is or give you a hint and you suddenly get it, you're like, oh yeah, I knew that. It's kind of like this meta awareness of what you have in your mind. The problem there was accessing it. You couldn't quite connect the neurons to get it, let's say. So the second step is, how do you structure the information? How do you structure those pictures into a way that's easily retrievable and more reliable? And that turns out there's a few different ways to do that. Some more popular than others, especially in memory competitions. Something like the memory palace is I don't know if you've heard of that, but that's the main thing we use to do that. And then the last step, so I kind of break it down into these 3 steps: visualization, structure or storage, and then the last one is review. So anything that you want to put into your long-term memory, you ultimately have to review it. But if you use the first 2 steps correctly, review is a really simple process, because you can just go to the place where you stored it and just watch the pictures that you placed there. And it's an enjoyable experience rather than this kind of stressful, tiresome studying session where you're just poring over numbers again and again and again,
That's really interesting, man. So I think that the visualization and the review are probably pretty straightforward, makes sense to a lot of folks. How about the memory palace? How would somebody go about building and utilizing one of those?
Yeah, so the memory palace is a technique that's been around for thousands of years. The Greeks supposedly invented it, but there's been other civilizations where there's kind of clues that they were using it as well in other forms. But basically, it's taking some kind of physical structure, a space, a palace. They had palaces back then, I guess. You can use your house; it's fine. And you basically imagine a pathway through it, through that space. And that serves as basically a place to store information, these pictures. And all you do is, as you're navigating around this memory palace in your mind, you just place the pictures of the things that you're trying to memorize. Now, the route that you take through this space should be common sense. It's something that shouldn't be weird and all over the place. It's just you walking through that space as you would in real life, just you're imagining it. So if you're in your house, maybe you imagine you start at the front door, because that's where you enter usually, and then you maybe go through all the rooms in some kind of order. And that order preserves the order of the information. And it also gives the information a place to live. So if I were to say, hey, can you get that information for me and tell it to me? You say, oh yeah, I put it in my house, right? I filed it away in my house, and it's easy to access. I can walk through my house and pick up all the pieces very casually and easily. And that banks on a few things that our brains are also very good at, which is thinking in terms of spatial information. Our brains are really good at remembering that. And then also, you're very familiar with a lot of these places that you're using as memory palaces. So walking through it or memorizing the route, you don't really have to memorize it. So it's kind of a hack to something familiar that you already know, and using that as kind of like to bootstrap the kind of memorization process on.
Got it. So if I had a memory palace of my house and, for example, I was using it to remember vocabulary for a language, would it be walking through specific rooms and then looking at objects, and each object would apply to a word? Or how would somebody sort of go about individualizing words for different places in their homes, I guess?
Yeah, so memory palace doesn't always have to be the go-to thing. It really depends on how you plan on accessing the information. So in the example you said, where you're trying to learn, say 100 vocab words in a foreign language, how are you going to access that? Is it in order? Probably not. The way you're probably going to do it is somebody hopefully is going to speak to you in a language that you don't know. And, as you hear a word, it should come up and as a light bulb, and the translation because you memorized it, but you don't know in what order or where you'll hear the word, or if you'll hear the word at all, right? So that one, for that case, you probably don't need a memory palace, but you do still need to find some way to anchor that information to your brain. And the way you would do that is take the foreign word and come up with a picture for it, and then kind of in the same way that you would attach images to the locations in a memory palace, you would attach the image to the image that you have for it in your own language that you already know, Like if you're trying to remember the word chien, which means dog in French, chien kind of sounds like, if you read it, it looks like the word chain, maybe a little bit. It's kind of close. So that's my image, maybe, is like this chain. And then I'm going to attach that image to something that's already grounded in my mind, which is dog, right? So maybe imagine wrapping a chain around a dog to go take him for a walk, But if it was a memory palace, like let's say you're memorizing a list of grocery items, right? So there's a list here of consecutive items. Maybe the order doesn't matter too much, but let's say you do want them in order because you're going through the aisles in a certain order and you don't want to waste time or something. So yeah, each location would house a picture of the thing you're trying to memorize. So at your front door, maybe the first thing you got to pick up are clementines, right? So maybe you come up with a picture. I think oh my darling, right? Clementine, that song or something. You would imagine that song maybe coming out of your door, or if you knock on the door, that song kind of plays out of it or something like that, some imagery for that. Then you walk in the door, and then the next location would be kind of your entryway, and you would place the next picture for the next item, and so on. So then you'd have this route filled with all the pictures of things that you wanted to memorize. And you could say that forwards, backwards. You could go to specific pieces of that information list and just pull it out.
That's super interesting, man. Now, can you touch on making things memorable in an evolutionary sense? So maybe tying a memory in with things like sex, fear, shock, awe, and how can we use those concepts to our advantage when we want to remember something?
Yeah, and so part of that visualization process, also tapping into that emotional side of things that we as humans tend to remember or have a difficult time forgetting. If you can add that sauce to your picture, it's like wildfire. So I often tell people, think of things that are absurd, like funny, kind of gory or violent, sexual, uncomfortable. All those things, if you think about similar kinds of situations in your life memories around those things, the happiest moments, the saddest moments, the kinkiest moments, you remember those with a ton of detail, versus the mundane, everyday stuff that that don't really pop out, So that's a huge component of when you visualize, try to add that emotion in there.
So what would be an example of that? How could somebody, we could use the grocery list example. How would somebody use that in everyday life?
Which part? The emotional thing?
So tying, I don't know, if a banana reminds them, it's like a phallic symbol or something,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know how PG your listeners
say whatever you want.
Yeah. But, some examples when I'm memorizing cards, I have a lot of preset images for some of the cards as people with actions and objects. So sometimes I get some really weird shuffles and it ends up being, a dog being fucked by a mushroom or something, and it's like, people I know, like my brother is like having anal sex with a horse or something like that. And it's like, I didn't paint that. It just happened because it shuffled that way. I have a horse, I have my brother, and then I have like the sexual act, and they all happen to mix together. So, but I don't fight it because unfortunately, I'm not going to forget that image as little as I want to think about it. I welcome it because it's like glue, So you just, some people have preferences. Maybe you prefer to keep it more funny than sexual or sexual rather than violent or something. But, and people can feel out what tends to stick for them. But, I dive into those head first because I know that it's just really going to make everything stick a lot more.
So you have a set deck of cards in your head already that you have tied to certain symbols right now, right? Is that right?
Yeah. So some of the things that happen at these competitions, like numbers and cards, for example, they're a finite set in a way. Obviously, they can be shuffled billions upon billions of different ways, depending on the size. But there's only 52 cards. That's not going to change. And for numbers, there's only 10 digits, right? So for each kind of combinations, I can maybe prepare myself to see any of those combos and I have an image for each kind of possibility ready to go. So I have 52 different people that represent each of the cards. And also on top of that, each person has an action and an object associated with it. So I can kind of weave together, I have a few options, to weave together.
Can we do a little practice of like 4 or 5 cards or something and see what pops up?
Yeah, sure. Let me grab a deck here. Hold on. Yeah, so the idea when I memorize cards or when anybody memorizes cards at these competitions, they're pretty much doing the same thing. So I'll look at every 3 cards and I look at the first one and say, okay, who's the person there? That's my image. And then the second card, I take the action. And then the third, I take the object. So every 3 cards is kind of this, up in the air, I don't know what I'm going to get, kind of potluck image of almost like the game Clue. It was this person doing this with this in this room, right? And I put them in my memory palace. So in this example, I have, I think these were in some kind of order because these are all black, but whatever.
I could just name cards if you want.
That too. We can do both. But let's start with this one. This is six of clubs. That's Stephen Colbert. And he's dropping or saying oops to a cross. Okay? So these three cards represent that order of that image. Stephen Colbert dropping a cross. And so I would place that image in the first location of my memory palace. Let's say it's my old apartment. The first location is my bed. Okay? So there's Stephen Colbert on top of my bed. You know, maybe he's oiled up or something really weird. And he's just dropping crosses everywhere because he's just like being a naughty, TV host. I don't know. And then you go on to the next one. It's Arnold Schwarzenegger driving a bat, like an animal flying bat. And that happens next to the bed. It goes into my bathroom. Okay, so Arnold Schwarzenegger's like driving furiously while sitting on the toilet. And in his hands, he has like, instead of a steering wheel, like a bat that he's like holding by its wings or something like that. And then you continue that process through the whole deck. And then when it comes time to recall it all, you go back to your first location, which is the bed, right? And I say, okay, that's Stephen Colbert saying oops to a cross. And I just translate it back. So it's six of clubs, two of spades, two of clubs. And Arnold Schwarzenegger driving the bat was ace of spades, nine of spades, seven of clubs.
That is fascinating, man. That's so interesting. So once you set up what each card means, you're essentially set. You can remember anything as long as you have the sequence in the correct order.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. And think about it, like, a few cards is not a big deal. You could probably remember it just by brute force. But if we continued with 52 cards, you can imagine that just memorizing like the numbers and the suits alone without any technique is overwhelming. It's too much. But Arnold Schwarzenegger on the toilet and all that stuff, that's really easy, I think. We could all do it. You just don't know the translation, you'd have to learn that part, but the pictures part is easy.
Now, what about smell? Because smell seems to be able to almost bypass the remembering aspect of memory altogether. At least it seems like that, and get straight to the heart of an experience. So do you know what's going on there with smell and memory?
Yeah, I've had a fascination with that ever since getting into memory because, like you said, it's one of these things that can take you back, so sharply to this
decades.
point. Decades, yeah, a long time too. But at the same time, it's one of the hardest things to like remember right now. Like if I were to tell you to remember a smell, like to pull it up, it's like really difficult, right? I could say like, can you remember what smoke smells like? And that's okay. I mean, you can kind of describe it, but even it's hard to like, in the same way that I say, think of a picture of a cigarette, right? You probably have it right away, right? It's floating in your mind. But if I were to say, imagine the smell of smoke, it's not so clear because what does that mean? Are we thinking about like words to describe it? Are you imagining the actual sensation? It's not going to mirror as closely as just picturing. So it's funny that one of the things like the senses that has such a strong effect on us in terms of pinpointing memories is also one of the hardest to kind of recreate. So I don't know much more than that, but I do try to kind of include smell in my imagery as well as best I can. And usually it ends up being me thinking about, what the description of the smell might be from what I know. Like if there's shit involved, I know it's going to smell bad, and kind of make my nose turn, right? But it's not like I get a specific scent of my son's diaper, that like comes to mind. That varies. There's a whole like, range of smells that come out of those diaper pails, but shit in general smells bad. So I can imagine that smell,
Yeah, I'm trying to think that maybe there was some sort of evolutionary tie with like a poisonous plant smelling a certain way versus one that's safe. Like, I don't know. That's just some random theory, but maybe there's something to it.
Yeah, in terms of smell, yeah, I'm sure there's some explanation in that sense. I often do say that, why we remember pictures really well is kind of evolutionary for sure, because, some of the earliest things we had to do before we even spoke, our ancestors, was to be able to stay alive. And to stay alive, you had to recognize that this plant was not edible because you'll die if you eat it, versus this one, which is, a blueberry. It tastes delicious, So those were just visual things that we had to our brains had to be very good at in order to survive,
Makes sense. Now, I'd love to dig into some common practical takeaways for folks. So the most common one is probably remembering names, right? So how do you recommend that folks go about improving the retention around names so they don't have to be like, hey, you, what's up? Yeah, like everybody's been there, right? Yeah.
Right. I was going to, usually I say like it's one of the easiest things to practice every day now. But now it's like, you're stuck at home. Nobody's meeting anybody. So maybe wait until the quarantine is lifted. Right. But yeah, it's names is a great way to practice this kind of process, those 3 steps. And you have to tweak it a little bit to be more realistic with kind of a real life situation where you might meet someone. But the first thing I always tell people is, since there's such like a stigma around, how people feel about their memories, most people are kind of embarrassed or feel like they have a bad memory. And that's just who they are. They're Nelson, the bad memory guy, horrible with names, and that's that. But we all have this capability of having a really good memory if we try. And if you, approach how to memorize a little more structured. So first step is always try. A lot of people are giving up before they even give their memory a chance. And of course that feeds itself. So you're going to have a bad memory if you say you have a bad memory. So once you get past that, in terms of the interaction of meeting someone, shaking their hand, learning their name, and trying to memorize it, the process goes something like this, where, as I'm approaching them, I choose something about their features on their face or their body that strikes me. Okay. And that's going to be my anchor, kind of like the same way I use my front door or any of the rooms in my memory palace. Their face or body becomes a memory palace for their name to me. When I hear their name, I turn it into a picture. And so that means, maybe the name reminds me of someone that I can picture, or maybe it sounds like something, like an object, like a noun of something I can easily picture. Maybe it's a more difficult name, so I have to maybe think a little harder. Sometimes I break the name down into syllables and work from there. But then I put those images or that image on the feature, just like I did on the front door or, on my bed. And that is the connection. That's the way to store the name. And then review, I always play this game with myself, is I always try to remember people's names before I leave a party or a business meeting, and I kind of go around the room scanning it, recalling the names that I put there, and that's kind of the process. And the other thing is practice. It's difficult sometimes to do that when you're talking to someone or you're nervous to meet someone and you're just trying to think of something cool to say, let alone do this whole process. So it does take a little bit of practice to get more comfortable and quicker at it.
So you're using an aspect of their face that you might find memorable to sort of jog your memory towards their name. Is that right?
Yeah. And a little more than that, because I'm actually using that feature as kind of a platform just to smother that image onto, right? So, like you have a very thick beard. I would use that. That's what I would just notice about you first. And especially that your name is Marcus. So I think of like a lot of these names I have preset images for. So Marcus, I think of a marker, like a Sharpie marker. So yours just looks like it's really like colored in dark. It's a strong colored beard. So that's an easy one for me. I just imagine a marker being kind of Sharpied all over your beard.
It's genius. Now, what about remembering where we left our keys? Now, I'll preface this by saying personally, I have a hard time understanding how folks do this, because I feel like the simple workaround is just like put them in the same place every time you come in the door. But
exactly, yeah.
For some reason, there's resistance to that idea. So how can folks remember where they put their keys?
Yeah. So I talk about this in my book. it's a tough one because a lot of it comes down to kind of your habit, right? And if you're kind of this person that just doesn't have much, I'm not saying this is bad, but some people just don't prioritize where they place their keys. So it's kind of the last thing you think about and you're tossing them everywhere. But yeah, I mean, the first step, like you said, is to try and maybe get some kind of bowl or a hook where you designate, right inside the door to put the keys, right? And I always try to think in terms of like, if I know I'm bad with that, I tried to take smart Nelson and have him anticipate what dumb, forgetful Nelson will do and try to dummy proof his life. So, if I'm always coming in through the front door and I always kind of like encounter this little table before I walk into my living room, then maybe that's where I should, baby proof Nelson's key dropping, rather than putting it in the kitchen or something like that, where I'll probably forget by that point. That's the first step. Second way, in terms of like an actual memory technique, another thing I do sometimes is as I'm dropping the keys down, wherever I put them, I'll try to do some kind of, sounds ridiculous, but it works. I'll say something out loud in a weird voice or something unique, or I'll do some kind of weird movement, or, pinch myself or something, out of the ordinary at that moment. So when it comes time to remembering where I put the keys, I'm going to think, oh, it's where I did like that spin in the kitchen, right? Out of the blue. So I go back to where I did that, Now, the problem with all this is you still have to be kind of alert enough or remember to do this, right? What I tell people, if they're like, well, I'm hopeless, I'm never going to remember to do that every time I'm put my keys down, I'm going to forget to do it. But if you start thinking about memory as something that you can improve, you're aware of these techniques and you start using them more and more, they just become something you instinctively do kind of with everything. And memory becomes kind of like an important part of your everything you do. So it's hard not to think like that when you place your keys down,
I like that. Now, how do you look at the balance between, say, writing things down in order to remember them? So, for example, important dates, meetings, but then not taking it to the point where you're literally not using your memory at all. Right. And I'll share with you how I think about this, and then you can correct me if I'm doing it wrong. So I use a calendar and I write everything in it that I need to. But the way that I think about it is that if I'm writing these things down, first off, I'm not going to miss meetings and important dates, but also I feel like I'm freeing up memory, or essentially bandwidth, for other things that I'm working on remembering, like maybe it's a language, because I believe that memory is a finite resource. Like, nobody remembers everything. So what are your thoughts on that, and then as well as memory being a finite resource?
Yeah, let me start with that, because you're right. There has to be a finite amount of things that we can memorize, but I think it's way beyond what we think could be a reasonable number. And even in memory competitions, we're nowhere near that. But just some of the things that me and some of the up and coming kids that are destroying the records are doing just seems impossible. And it's like at these competitions, it's one thing after the other. One event, you're done, you're memorizing something else. And, we're able to keep all of that in our minds. And, that goes on top of everything else we know, and you can think of like, okay, well, maybe you could say, okay, well, what I can memorize is limited by how many memory palace locations I have, right? Okay, so then I think, okay, well, maybe I can just think of all the places I've ever been to, and those are memory palaces. Okay, so that's finite for sure. But then you can think of, okay, well, for each location, each house, let's say, memory palace, each room could be an infinite number of, well, maybe not infinite, but a large set of, subdivisions even, right? And then even then you could imagine yourself to be an inch tall, and then suddenly that room is like a universe, so you can always expand this memory palace, and it's hard to say where that limit is. but yeah, I think somewhere there has to be some kind of limit. I just think it's further than you think. So in terms of what you were saying, where do you kind of draw the line in terms of freeing up space? So I don't know if I necessarily believe that, but I do believe in the sense that we're freeing up almost the anxiety of having to remember things, right? It's a good feeling when you have something kind of written down and you know that it's on your phone and your app, whatever, and it's not in your brain where you feel like maybe it could be lost, right? Or it takes more effort at least to keep it there. With memory techniques, and if you practice them, there's less anxiety about all that stuff. So it's kind of more inviting to do that more often. And I feel like there's some power in that. You feel empowered by it. I think you're doing good for your brain as well. But does that mean that I remember absolutely everything that I encounter? Definitely not. And there are times when I write things down, but I always think of it from the perspective like I like to do this and I want to exercise my brain. I do it from like a health perspective. So oftentimes when I meet someone and I'm getting their phone number, even though I don't really care to have their phone number memorized, I do memorize it before I put it in my phone. And I'll usually wait till the end of the day and then put it in my phone. And that way, I kind of get a bit of both. I've worked on my memory. I held it in my memory for the rest of the day, and then I kind of offload it a little bit, because I know if I wanted to memorize my whole, phone directory, I could. I just don't know if it's something I care to do. And I really only want to memorize the things that I really care about and want to have like on hand.
That makes a ton of sense. And touching on brain health, I know you're passionate about Alzheimer's, and personally, I think it's only a matter of time until the research just becomes more and more clear on the link between lack of sleep and Alzheimer's disease. So what is the role of sleep
and diet too, I think.
Totally. What's the role of sleep in memory? And have you noticed like how good sleep can impact your memory versus poor sleep, and then comparing the two?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Leading up to a competition, I really try to get at least 8 hours of sleep because I take a lot of notes about how my performance is. And with a 1.5-year-old and another baby on the way, I've really noticed how detrimental the lack of sleep can be. And nowadays, now it's a bit better, but when my son was first born, those months, it was, do you have kids or no?
No, I don't.
No? Okay. It was, I could say maybe 4 or 5 hours. And I know that, they've done studies where people who were deprived of sleep for a straight 24 hours did a test versus people who slept only like 4 to 6 hours over the course of 10 days or something like that, performed at the end of those 10 days, they were performing just as bad as somebody who hadn't slept for 24 hours, right? And you think, okay, 6 hours of sleep doesn't sound so bad, but over time, that's still really bad. There's also been studies on the different stages of sleep and how it affects recall the next day or performance that have to do with memory. And the earlier part of your sleep where you're like deeper into the MREM or something, that's where your memory kind of gets consolidated. So getting that deeper sleep at the beginning actually is better for your memory the next day, or down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. The way I've heard it explained is almost like when you're putting in the work to memorize things during the day, that sleeping is almost like pressing the save button on a computer and sort of putting those memories into
transferring it to long-term. Yeah. From the, you have it in your short-term memory in the hippocampus, and then at night, if you get the right amount of sleep, it's kind of offloading it onto your external hard drive, the cortex,
Yeah, so the brain, you touched on nutrition, the brain uses an inordinate amount of calories throughout the day considering its size. So have you noticed that when you're training for a memory competition that your calorie requirements actually change as a result?
Yeah, when I first started into this stuff, I wouldn't have even thought of that. But in more recent years, I've kind of wondered about that. I don't train nearly as extensively as I used to, but there are definitely days where I've spent hours and hours sitting there memorizing, even at competitions where you're forced basically to sit there for 3 days memorizing. And yeah, I'm just like drained, obviously mentally, but physically I feel like I'm not sweating or anything, but I feel like I've definitely burned calories, and I'm hungry. I have low energy. I have to replenish that.
Yeah, totally, man. Now, before we get to where folks can find more about your work, is there anything that we didn't get to today that you'd like to leave my listeners with?
I have questions for you, but I don't know if that's for the podcast.
Oh, okay.
But just because it's about nutrition and the brain, because I don't know everything about nutrition for the brain, but I've experimented with different diets, and I'm a real big advocate of the keto diet at the moment. I've done it for a number of months on and off, and compared the results, and I just feel a lot better on it. But I'm just curious your take on what is kind of the best brain health diet, if there is one.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's probably different for every person. Like, for example, if let's hypothetically say the ketogenic diet was the best diet for brain health, but if someone's not able to live that way, practically speaking, in their everyday life, it sort of becomes irrelevant. So then if somebody can implement that and they feel great with the ketogenic diet, awesome. But if somebody likes to include more carbohydrate in their diet and they feel good with that, and they can stick to that and maintain a healthful body weight and all that sort of stuff, then I'd say that's the best diet for brain health for that individual. So it is a little bit personalized, but if you feel great with the ketogenic diet, you're mentally clear, all that sort of stuff, I'd say it's a good way to go if you feel good.
But because for me, I feel like I could probably say pretty confidently, I think for everybody, that if you cut out like processed foods or sugars, right? I mean, for me at least, I just feel so much sharper, right? Is there like one food or one kind of category of food that you could confidently say, or that in the literature out there that says that is something that is beneficial for your brain?
Yeah, well, I mean, processed foods definitely are inferior to single ingredient whole foods. Now, eliminating processed food from your diet is no doubt going to be a better way to go than including it. That's right. There's no debate there.
Okay. I'd be curious to pick your brain in another call about all this stuff, but
I'd be
cool.
happy to chat about that. But where can folks find you, your books, social handles, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so my website's nelsondellis.com. People can go there and explore more about me and reach out to me. My book is called Remember It. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, all those. And that's more of an adult related, it's anybody can read it. But I have a kid's book coming out this summer, end of this summer, for like middle schoolers to help with school. And that's available for pre-order on Amazon as well. It's called Memory Superpowers. And then my handles, my main thing is YouTube. I make a bunch of videos with memory-related content. You can just search my name on YouTube and please subscribe.
Yeah, man, cool. I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. And thanks again for coming on. That was a great chat.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Great questions.
I hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Nelson Dellis. Now, if you're interested in personalized one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can head over to n1fitness.com/coaching or just click the link in the show notes below. Also, feel free to follow me up on Instagram at n1fitness and friend me at Marcus Sadu on Facebook. I'll catch you guys on the next episode. See ya.